Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Barry Graham. It's my absolute pleasure and honor to be your host for this session, this Digital Leadership Summit, sponsored by BMC. We're calling this a journey to zero touch automation. We called it the journey. We're going to be talking very much about the steps that need to be taken to get to a point we all think we need to be at, people coming from different points. So we thought we'd talk about it as a journey. In terms of the agenda for today, I'm joined by Paul Gamp from PCCW. He's going to show us a case study. But before that, we've got a video from Ram Chakravarti. Unfortunately, Ram couldn't join us today from BMC. He's going to talk about BMC's experiences and their views in this area. And then we've got a panel discussion where we'll also be joined by Joseph George from BMC. Thank you, Joseph, for stepping in for one of your colleagues who wasn't able to make it at the last minute. And also we'll have Lawrence Norman, who's Chief Architect for NTT Data, to share some of their experiences in this area. This session will be recorded. So if you're listening along and you think that would be really interesting to one of my colleagues, or I didn't really follow that bit, then you'll be able to watch it back, but also forward the link to some of your colleagues if you think that would be interesting to them. We want to make it interactive. The panel discussion in particular, we have some thoughts of things to talk about, but very much like to hear the audience's questions. So particularly as we're going through Ram's presentation and Paul's presentation, if you have any questions on those, or if you want to discuss, hear the panel's opinions on some of the topics that we raised there, then please do you should have a Q&A box on the screen there somewhere. There's a chat box and a Q&A box. If you can put the questions in the Q&A, then that works a little bit better for us. So, I'll kick off. I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the work the TM Forum's been doing. We've been showing this slide for some time, this idea of the transformation that needs to happen in the business systems that support CSP's businesses. So we've talked about the transition from a traditional communication services provider to a digital service provider. And we talk about zero touch, we talk about automation and self-service. And we've always talked about this need for an AI-enabled real-time operations. This idea that the networks are getting to the point where manual operations are no longer possible. So we have an autonomous network. But the business systems that lay on top of it are also too complex to be manually operated. I pulled this slide out because it comes from a TM Forum white paper, and it's very interesting to look at some of the benefits that we see for artificial intelligence, for AI in the CSP world. So things like 12 billion in consumer benefits, 14 billion sales of self-organizing network solutions, 30% reduction in infrastructure spending. Lots of very clear monetary potential for AI and how it can transform our business. But I think what's more interesting is that the kinds of services we're talking about here need it. This isn't a question of, well, we could do this manually, but it would be more cost effective to automate it. This is a world where, as I've said, the networks are getting so complex that they have to be automated, but the services we want to create, the self-service identity, this idea of zero wait, zero touch and zero trouble. So when we launch a new service, we can't be manually reconfiguring the network to deal with that. Those services might be being launched by our partners. There may be a number of very small players in the ecosystem who are launching new services in a marketplace. We can't be doing something as the operators to make those work each time. And when subscribers are signing up, we can't be manually getting involved in that. So if that needs a reconfiguration of the network, reconfiguration of any of the services behind that, that needs to operate. AI has been seen as a key piece of automation. One of the interesting things, I was looking through some of the recent work the forum have been doing, and one of the things that jumped out at me was this idea of an AI canvas. So the AI canvas is a simple tool, and I've got an example of it here, to just look at how we're going to implement AI and all the things we're going to need to do and the impacts of that. And I think AI technology has been around for a while. We've been talking about it for a while. But what's really interesting is, how do you make it work? How do you make it work with the rest of the organization? So we know that there are many things we have to change. Potentially, if we have AI operating a new service being onboarded or something like that, if that doesn't succeed for some reason, how do we hand that over to a manual environment? How are our partners going to cope with us having AI-enabled systems? How are we going to do the continuous integration? How are we going to test? And the AI canvas is a great tool to enable us to start thinking about those things. And the other thing I looked at was this slide, just showing the number of TM Forum assets that are being updated to include the impact of AI. So we see a typical sort of service management through deployment to production, and you can see there the whole range of processes. These are things the TM Forum has made standard process models for, and a whole range of those that have been impacted by AI, and we're having to take a different approach. And I think that's, for me, is a really key point, that automation, and particularly AI-driven automation, and how you manage that, isn't just a technology play. It is something that impacts across the business and something that we have to adapt to. And that's why we talk about the journey. The journey is really, where are we starting? What impact does that have to the business? And what changes do we have to make to the business in order to adapt to this new technology and make it part of our way of doing things on a day-to-day basis? One of the most important aspects of AI is data. Automation and AI automation is driven from data and getting access to that data. And so that is very much an area that BMC have been looking at. So as I mentioned, we have a video presentation now from Ram Chakravarti, who couldn't be with us, talking through some of their experiences with what they're talking about, data ops. So again, this is more about how we change our whole business to move into the world of living with this data.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ram Chakravarti, the CTO at BMC Software, and I'm here to share my perspective on data ops as an enabler of success for data and analytics transformations. First, let's examine why data and analytics continue to be a big deal. Next, let's briefly examine traditional approaches to said transformations and the challenges encountered therein. Finally, we look at data ops as a new recipe for successful data and analytics programs in a little more detail, inclusive of implementation considerations. I'm stating the obvious when I say that nearly every interaction by almost every person on the planet leaves a data trail. We can definitely collect all kinds of data and store a lot more data for way cheaper than ever before. We can process said information way faster and better with advances in computing, so much so that the classical Moore's law has ceded turf to the emergent Rose's law with the advent of quantum computing. And finally, we can definitely analyze said information better on a daily basis with the ubiquitousness of AI, notwithstanding the fact that we are still in the early stages of the AI era. So, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that data management was the largest area of enterprise investment in 2020. At $73 billion, it accounts for nearly 14% of total spend on enterprise software. And that does not include analytics and BI, which at $26 billion constitutes another 5%. So together, these constitute nearly 1/5 the total spend in enterprise software. And mind you, it does not include the embedded analytics in CRM, ERP, and other commercial off-the-shelf solutions, nor does it include investments in foundational data infrastructure. So that's pretty awesome from a spend standpoint and the importance of data management. To back this up, BMC Software and 451 Research conducted an extensive survey of 1,200 companies across 20 industry sectors and 11 geographies. And each of these companies had at least $100 million in revenue, USD, and had at least 500 employees. And the survey points clearly to the primacy of place that organizations hold in terms of becoming a data-driven business, both in terms of the current importance as well as 2 years from now. To further underscore this point, IDC research estimates that the total spend on big data and business analytics solutions, inclusive of the foundational infrastructure, is going to be around $190 billion in 2021 and is poised for double-digit growth through 2022 and beyond. That's pretty staggering. So with that as the preamble, let's briefly look at traditional approaches to data and analytics transformations. Now, these are tried and tested approaches from the days of data warehousing and BI, and that have now been refined for the more advanced analytics techniques. One such method is shown here that looks pretty all-encompassing in that it includes a data and analytics strategy, the supporting architecture, the operating model, and the organizational considerations, as well as the culture and execution elements. However, the vast majority of data and analytics transformations fail to deliver against business expectations. These statistics present a pretty grim picture, conveying that 1/5 or less of said initiatives are successful. Now, to call them colossal failures is perhaps a bit harsh. It's more a case of over-promising and under-delivering. So, logical next step would be to figure out what are potential reasons for failure. And these are my reasons for failure. I've lived through many of these, and I'm sure you have your own reasons for failure, but this is mine. First, exploding number of data sources compounded by newer business models make simplification difficult. For CSPs in particular, surveys specific to CSP as well as cross-industry surveys point to significant variability in data quality and inconsistent data models as being the primary choke point here. Second, process mismatch. Traditional data management processes do not lend themselves well to the application of new AI techniques. Third, lack of collaboration. This is typically between business and IT organizations, and the lack of collaboration stymies the requisite cultural shift needed for success. Four, significant investments. These are non-trivial programs that take multiple years and require meaningful investment. As an anecdote, a mid-sized company typically requires between 50 and 75 million US dollars for a data and analytics transformation. Number five, scarce talent pool. This is not just about the massive demand for data-centric skills. This is about critical path skills that require not just technical expertise, but also functional domain expertise that is really difficult to get. Number six, my absolute favorite, last mile delivery challenges. This is the inability to successfully operationalize and scale in alignment with the business need for flexibility, agility, as well as configurability. Next, shiny toy syndrome. This is technology vendor lock-in at the expense of operationalization or the requisite collaboration. Lastly, many of these data initiatives are foundational in nature, so it is difficult to quantify and monetize the benefits. Hence, there is lack of clarity on what defines success. With all of these, there have been many approaches to figure out how you could improve the success rate of data and analytics programs. With that, let me introduce DataOps as a new recipe for successful data and analytics programs. There are a couple of pretty solid industry definitions here. However, I have my own take. I define DataOps as the application of agile engineering and DevOps best practices to the field of data management to rapidly turn new insights into fully operationalized production deliverables that unlock the business value of data. With that said, let's tease out the constituent parts, what I call the critical components. There are 5 of these from my standpoint. First, extensive collaboration between the data managers on one side and the data consumers on the other is a must-have. Data managers include your data stewards, data owners, data architects, data engineers, and the data consumers include business owners, data scientists, power users, and what have you. Process standardization and refinement, I touched upon these. Organizations have to change their existing data management procedures and practices to not stymie AI method application. Third, right fit technology. Again, anecdotally, a data and analytics leader that I'm acquainted with has a simple rule of thumb. Anytime a new AI method needs to be applied to an analytics use case that is based on a traditional method, they look to see if the new method provides an order of magnitude percentage improvement over the traditional method. If it doesn't, the migration is a no-go. That seems pretty pragmatic. Speaking of pragmatic, you also require a judicious application of data governance, security, and metadata management, both in terms of tools and practices, so as not to be overly burdensome or overly lax. Lastly, pervasive automation. We talked about data ops being the application of DevOps best practices, so it should be apparent that automation is fundamentally important to the success of data ops. And automation here refers to orchestration, configuration, provisioning, and self-service. Let's tease out automation in a little more detail. With a simplified data model, let me explain how I think about automation here. At the bottom in the black, you have the foundational infrastructure components, and automation here refers to configuration, provisioning, and self-service. The core of the data pipeline is a set of constituent parts for data operations, all the way from ingesting, integration, aggregation and harmonization, application of data quality, testing, deploying, and monitoring. Of equal importance are metadata management, data governance, and security. And of course, the ingestion components have to contend with a variety of data sources, both traditional and emerging. And the pipeline really delivers to a set of consumers, both traditional as well as the more advanced analytics of the data science community. Across all of these, there is one component which is a constant, and that is data pipeline orchestration. So data pipeline orchestration is basically the puzzle piece that binds all of these constituent parts and ensures a successful translation from source to fully operationalized insights. So orchestration has risen in prominence, has become a critical enabler of data ops, with the emergence and importance of data ops as an enabler of success for data and analytics. So the takeaway here is that you need enterprise scale orchestration that provides a requisite agility, scale, and the flexibility so as to eliminate data silos and turn these data sources and stitch them together into fully operationalized higher order insights, actionable insights for the business. So with that, let's finally turn our attention to implementation considerations. As with any new capability, data ops 2 needs to be instituted in the organization in a set of digestible steps over multiple horizons. There are a lot of words on this slide, so let me demystify it into 3 succinct points. Number 1, in the near term, apply data ops, a small set of data ops capabilities to 1 or 2 high value use cases. And these should typically be in collaboration between the business and IT, as well as automation, perhaps orchestration. Now, once you apply these, use this to learn from, refine, and scale this in the midterm over a set of analytics use cases across your business functions. Lastly, when you reach steady state, steadily introduce new capabilities from a data ops standpoint into the organization as digestible bites as business as usual. So as my session draws to a close, let me wish each and every one of you the very best in your data and analytics programs, and hopes that each one of you becomes a data ops success story. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ram. Sorry, had a small control problem there for a moment. I'd like to now introduce Paul Gamp from PCCW. Paul is based in Asia, so he's stayed up very late for this one. Thank you very much for that, Paul. But he's the CTO at PCCW Global, and he's going to take us through a case study of some of the work that they've been doing.
Great, thank you, Barry. Good morning and good evening, everyone, and thank you to TM Forum and to BMC for giving me this opportunity to present. So I'm just going to take control of the screen and bear with me for a few minutes while we wait for the slides to progress. Great, thank you. So I'm going to take you on the journey, and it's interesting that the set of slides that Barry drew up earlier talked about the why, what, and how of this zero-touch provisioning and automation journey began, and that's really what I'm going to show you in our partnership with BMC and our relationship with TM Forum. To begin with, the why. The reason that we chose to begin our journey to zero-touch provisioning really is about the demand that we were seeing from our customer base. And what this set of statistics show you on this slide is that Console Connect, which was acquired by PCCW Global back in 2017, has become a critical component as enterprises begin to embrace this software-defined cloud interconnection. And I think the speakers that we've seen today have really highlighted the importance of automation, pervasive automation, to be part of a precursor if you're intending to adopt AI operations. So one of the things that Console Connect does, and one of the reasons that we have focused on this automation is because a lot of our customers are moving their workloads to cloud, the 90% per annum growth rate that we see here in cloud spend. There's a continuous evolution, particularly in the last 2 years, where we see more and more traffic moving between data centers, 28% growth rate, and general interconnection as we see the work from home and hybrid working environments become more common, and a 45% per annum increase from 2019 to 2023. Perhaps most exciting, though, is the number of interactions we're beginning to have with our large enterprise customers around edge compute. And really, if you intend to operate at scale, what our customers are telling us is that they need to have a fully automated, software-defined interconnection network. So our journey really began with the why, because it was user-driven. Our users wanted us to be a technology provider that delivered them this capability to automate their networks. And so the company underwent a significant transformation in not just in how we perceive our technology stack, but also to ensure that we're part of this journey as our existing user base went from traditional telecommunications provided managed connectivity services to something that feels much more like a zero-touch automation. As our customers began their journey to cloud, we needed to ensure that the products and services that we offered were relevant to them and part of that cloud journey. So traditionally, we would have seen ourselves as a telecommunications provider operating an optical network and a layer 2 and a layer 3 network. Today, we fundamentally perceive ourselves and believe that we are an automated digital platform provider. And the API specifications that Barry referenced earlier have been core to helping us design our strategy around ordering, settlement, and management of those services via API. And what that has enabled us to do is to begin to think of our value proposition, not in terms of the core connectivity, but more importantly around the meeting place of infrastructure and applications. Because in the traditional network, the value proposition may be connectivity from headquarters to a branch office. Now the most critical connectivity could be from a branch office to a SaaS application. And how do you maintain that connectivity in the same sort of elasticity you have when provisioning a virtual machine? So the journey for us wasn't just a technical one. We really needed to understand the challenges of our user base as they were undergoing this technical transformation. And what we learned is that we needed to invest in our staff and in our colleagues to help us understand that digital transformation journey. So we've invested significantly throughout the organization, throughout the last number of years, ensuring that our teams are trained in cloud computing, trained in API development, trained in software development, as much as we're trained in network engineering. So it's been a very transformational journey for us at PCCW Global, predominantly to ensure we understand the why. Why are our customers wanting to have us deliver connectivity via an API? Why are TM Forum specifications so critical to that IT operations automation and the eventual goal of AIOps? So what that's allowed us to do is focus on this combination of three assets that are in our vision. This on-demand platform where traditional managed connectivity is now being delivered through zero-touch provisioning. The network that's always existed, but differentiates the quality of service that you can gain when you have the ability to do software-defined cloud interconnection. Certain workloads, when they move to a public cloud, still require mission-critical connectivity. And so the general internet access is not always appropriate for all forms of workloads. So the quality of service attribute of the network is of value if you can gain access to it in an automated fashion. And then discovery, a key component in building an ecosystem from our perspective and what we've learned is to enable members of that community to discover the endpoints across the network, whether that be a data center, a SaaS application, or a public cloud hyperscaler. And now talking about the how. And so part of our ability to go through this transformation is the long-running relationship that we've had with BMC. So our relationship with BMC began a very long time ago when we deployed Remedy on-premise, and then expanded our relationship with BMC in 2014 as we started to deploy the BMC Remedy suite more broadly across the organization, traditional land and expand. And then in 2018, we started to evaluate BMC's Helix product, and we're looking to adopt it as a SaaS application where BMC are able to manage that suite of applications for us, and we can focus on our business. We've adopted BMC Helix. We're a very happy and proud customer of BMC Helix, hosted in a public cloud provider, and that's helped us in many ways. And over the course of the next few slides, I'm going to explain how that's been core to our strategy in terms of delivering AIOps capability to our user base. But really, that journey began in terms of this transformational mindset at PCCW Global, where we needed to understand when our customers are saying they have a cloud-first strategy, what does that mean to us as a telecommunications service provider? So we adopted a cloud-first strategy in partnership with BMC, and that was part of the decision-making about adopting BMC Helix hosted in the cloud. Emerging in parallel with this adoption, and one of the core reasons why we were evaluating BMC Helix was this concept around deep API integration with our partners. What we started to see is that inter-carrier communication was beginning to evolve, and TM Forum has played a significant role in developing those API specifications. And so as our partnership base began to want to pursue API integration, it became more and more challenging for us to achieve that outcome when we were operating the BMC Remedy suite on-prem. The basic block and tackle of getting networking in place, the agility to upgrade and continue to maintain the latest version of the Helix suite. Part of our decision to adopt an API-first strategy was done in collaboration with BMC, who we work with to develop the API integrations with our partners. So cloud-first and an API strategy were key to helping us make the decision to get the value proposition of adopting BMC Helix. And then finally, data operations. Now that we're at this point in our evolution as an organization, we've been able to focus on data-driven decision-making because we've been able to move away from investing in maintaining an on-prem application to focusing on maintaining the data pool and the data lake of knowledge that we gain through that application and through our relationship with partners. A lot of our evolution has been driven by adoption of the scaled agile framework. And what you see here on the right-hand side is a number of our team members who've gone through training. As you can see, for an organization of our size, we've achieved a substantial amount of education and training, not just in cloud programs, but in BMC training programs, scaled agile framework training, and now have our own pool of internally certified training practitioners so that we're able to begin to train the trainer and continue our evolution and transformation into a technology company. So now let's focus a little bit about the how, and we're undergoing this transformation by looking at the role that BMC's Helix suite plays in our enterprise architecture, because as I mentioned, that's been core to our transformational journey. So this diagram illustrates our business architecture, which we break up into these 8 components. We have our web applications, both internal and external facing. We have our API gateways. We have sales and marketing, customer interaction, finance, business intelligence, etc. On the next slide, I highlight those areas where the BMC suite have been able to integrate and deliver value to the business, but looking at it from a portfolio perspective. So we use Helix for contact management and trouble ticketing, where our interaction with Remedy began. We also use it for business intelligence. As I mentioned earlier, part of the outcomes of adopting a cloud-first and API strategy means that we're able to do more deep analytics and begin to emerge that API operations capability. So we use Helix extensively in our customer reporting and in our internal reporting because of that capability. We use BMC Helix in our service delivery. And as I mentioned earlier, we do API integrations using BMC to help us as a co-development partner to integrate with our partners. We use Helix in our provisioning lifecycle, and we use it in our service assurance lifecycle, managing fault management and service level management. So I think that's important to represent that the suite of BMC software has been a key attribute to our ability to evolve our business architecture, and a partnership that's allowed us to continue to comply with TM forums, to reduce the cost of that integration, and to continue to expand best current practice in terms of the business architecture and where the Helix suite can add value to us. Diving a little more deeply, here you see an architectural diagram that illustrates how we've been able to integrate with each of our partners, adopting both TM Forum and the Helix suite. So we've broken this up into inbound and outbound. So the architectural diagram shows you we maintain an external API gateway. Even though we've adopted Helix as a SaaS application delivered to us, hosted by BMC in a hyperscaler cloud environment, we still maintain a separation of concerns and handle that external API gateway on our behalf. What that allows us to do is to accommodate specific requirements for each of our partners so that we can provide sandbox development environments and perhaps some variations in terms of implementation with respect to the implementation associated with each of our partners. And this has all been done using BMC Helix API and the TM Forum standards. And we're using that to ensure we've got maximum reusability across the code that we develop. From an outbound perspective, that's where we get the real zero-touch integration using the TM Forum and Helix. We've also configured BMC Helix to provide a callback into our APIs on the partner side, so that as issues statuses change across our network, think of the cases that we described earlier about zero-touch provisioning, zero-touch resolution, zero-touch fault management. Part of our ability to do so is because we're able to deeply integrate with our partners and provide this callback capability into their APIs as well. So what this means for us is we're focused in 4 key areas: technical, economic, service, and communities. What we're seeing, of course, is this evolution from hardware to software, where hardware provisioning, manually provisioning, is now becoming a software-defined component. When I go to provision a virtual machine in a public cloud provider, that's a point-click experience, very much the zero-touch provisioning that we started to talk about at the beginning of this presentation. So our transformational journey has enabled us to take our network service and deliver that in a similar form. So we have a software-defined cloud interconnection platform, just as we used to have software-defined virtual machine connection or virtual machine platforms. The relationship with BMC and Helix and the full suite of TM Forum specifications allowed us to focus on this transition from technical to commercial, but ensure that we can continue to provide high qualities of service and assurance around those transactions. And we're interdependent. We've now realized, and we're now acknowledging, and we're happy to embrace a community approach to delivering value to our users. So our partnership with BMC is that we're interdependent in terms of how we build out our business architecture, as you saw earlier. And make this transition where everything that we did, I think Barry introduced the topic about pervasive automation. Everything that we do, whether it be sign-on, account management, service automation, dashboarding, support, all of these capabilities need to be exposed to our users so that we can be part of their AIOps journey, so that they've got access to the telemetry of the network, the health of the network, etc. Technically, we're still delivering automated connectivity around infrastructure, whether that be a network, a cloud, or a data center. And perhaps most importantly for us, we see a journey where if you pursue this line of thought to zero touch provisioning, the next most logical outcome, and certainly where we think the 5G journey will end us, is in zero touch settlement. So in a number of forums, particularly in C-band, we have research initiatives and moving into production deployments around the tokenization of assets so that we can begin to build smart contracts on a distributed ledger across a partner ecosystem, so that we can not only use a tokenization of a service asset on a distributed ledger to deliver the confirmation of an order, but then use that attestation of an order delivery to drive through into a smart contract triggering and fully automated settlement, so that we have a full zero touch life cycle from quoting, ordering, provisioning, and settlement. Where that takes us in terms of the final destination for software-defined cloud interconnection, and an initiative that we're working on now with BMC is around software-defined cloud interconnection to BMC Helix. So what do I mean by software-defined cloud interconnection, and why is it so important in the users and customers that I speak with? I'll call out this statistic published by Gartner in the bottom right-hand corner. By 2023, 30% of medium and large enterprises will employ software-defined cloud interconnection services to connect to cloud service providers, up from 2% today. So dramatic drive, and predominantly from my perspective, driven as we see mission-critical workloads move from on-prem into public cloud. As a subscriber of BMC Helix in a hosted environment, I've lived that experience. I've taken a mission-critical application that was on-premise, and I've moved it into a public cloud provider delivered to me by the software vendor. In terms of the decision tree that I went through and the conversations I have with CIOs and CTOs in industry, there's probably 4 things that I would call out from this RightScale survey. First and foremost was this lack of resources and expertise. We've all been able to build a community of expertise around networking. We have network engineers, we understand IP protocols, we understand transmission protocols, and we're able to orchestrate, to a large extent, the local area network and the wide area network demands of the enterprise. However, when you begin to move to a cloud environment and need to deliver direct connectivity to that cloud, that pool of expertise has to change. If you are going to subscribe to AWS Direct Connect, or Google Cloud Interconnect, or Microsoft Azure Express Route, or IBM Cloud Connect, each of these cloud providers have a fundamentally different use case in terms of how you can gain access to those services. What that means is you need to build a body of knowledge around network engineering and a body of knowledge around software engineering. And for most enterprises, their primary objective is to deliver value to their users. It's not to build a software development community around automated connectivity to cloud. So this lack of expertise around connectivity and when you're moving to a cloud environment is one of the most common points of conversation in terms of my relationship with our user base. The second is this managing cloud expenditure. So all of the large-scale hyperscalers have an economic model that is predominantly challenging for a CIO or an IT manager to understand what the final outcome will be when they move an application into a cloud. And what is my compute work cost going to be? What is my network egress cost going to be? And what types of controls do I have around reducing or managing that cost? And finally, security. We've all enjoyed the benefits of private networking for a long period of time to protect as a line of defense in terms of mission critical applications. As we move those workloads into a public cloud, how do I maintain my security posture? And do I get to maintain my network perimeter as one of my security controls? So those three attributes show up most commonly in my conversations with my customers. It's a lack of resources and expertise around cloud automated connectivity, visibility and transparency around network expenditure when I move to a cloud environment, and what controls do I have? And then finally, how do I maintain my network security posture so I have a control element around my network? So they're the key things that stand out to me in the conversations that I've had. So our perspective, we've obviously been key in using our relationship with BMC Helix to deliver APIs for integrating issue resolution across our partnerships. But what we've also now been able to do is deliver software-defined cloud interconnection with BMC to Helix. So in this diagram, what you see here is our customers of Console Connect in a Console Connect enabled data center are able to access the web application or the Console Connect API to directly order a port and then order, settle, and manage connectivity to branches, to virtual machines, to internet on demand, or to BMC Helix and other partners in the ecosystem. That matters because with a single TM Forum API specification, we're able to open up an entire ecosystem of instant on-demand ordering and provisioning. And as I mentioned earlier, our goal will be to deliver settlement not via just payment, credit card or invoice, but also through a distributed ledger and smart contract. It matters because the enterprise demand set has changed. The enterprise wants to be able to provision connectivity, and whether that be to Helix in the cloud or whether it be to a virtual machine, in the same way that they're able to provision a public cloud virtual machine. There's an expectation that connectivity will be agile and pay as you go, and I don't have to commit to a long-term contract, just as I have that ability if I'm in a public cloud environment. Capacity is elastic. When I started to migrate my BMC Remedy instance from on-prem to on-cloud, there is a period of time where as a large volume of data, I needed to move on-prem into cloud, and I needed to have the elasticity of bandwidth so that I could commit, so that I didn't have to commit to, the 10 gig of network capacity I needed for that data ingestment, because that wasn't going to be my sustained requirement. I needed to be able to flex that bandwidth up and down. And via the Console Connect application, web app or API, I'm able to make those changes in real time. I mentioned earlier about the complexities that I hear about with our customer base in their cloud migration journey. And one of the benefits that we have is that by using a Console Connect API, I'm able to have a single entry point, irrespective of which cloud provider, or in this case, which partner I choose to be connected to. It's the same user experience, whether I want to connect to Amazon or to Azure or to BMC Helix. I've got the same user experience. And perhaps most importantly, it's in real time. I can provision that services, doing that zero-touch provisioning that we've talked about so far, and ensure that it can be done in seconds and minutes.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. We've talked about the idea of sort of zero touch environments, service on demand, and it's really interesting to see the actual realization of that there that you're delivering. So we're going to move to a panel discussion now. Very much would encourage, we've got a couple of questions here already, but if we could get some questions in from the audience, we can put them to our learning panel here. But just to introduce the new members of the panel here, Joseph George from BMC, Joseph joining us. Joseph works in BMC across telecoms and other industries. So we were chatting before, and he has some examples of how other industries are facing some of the similar challenges and different challenges to telecoms. So that's quite an interesting angle. But I'll start with Lawrence Norman from NTT Data. Lawrence, I'd be very interested to hear your take on Ram and Paul's presentations there. Compare that maybe to your experiences at NTT, some of the things you've been trying to do and some of the challenges and solutions that you've found.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it was funny. I had my notes down in front of me and I've been steadily ticking them off when I saw some of the assertions that are being made and sort of matching what my kind of thinking is. I think some things that jumped out there that we're also seeing in the implementations we do are around. It was interesting from Paul's presentation. It was the talk was all about new essentially new classes of go-to-market products. So rather than talking about AIOps or anything as a cost to the business, right, and something that nobody wants to know about, or the operational side of the business, it's seen as ability to change the business and create new, automated, to create competitive advantage basically in terms of delivering new products digitally, so that they can outcompete in the market. So that was a really interesting point. As part of my job, I do a lot of work in telco. I'm lucky enough to spend time in the NTT sports business as well, and we sponsor a lot of businesses. One of those is just finished now the IndyCar series race or series of races that finished in the US just now. It was interesting talking to the teams there about how they work and the use of the data there as a method of delivering competitive advantage. So they would call it, gathering up something like 240 sensors in each vehicle, processing them at over 250 miles an hour in some cases, and then synthesizing all that to deliver insights and information that allow that team to outcompete the other teams, right? So they call it situational awareness, and it gives them the insight they need to do to, as the way of doing their work, right? So it's not just the operational aspects of the race, it's how they outcompete the other teams. And I think that's how we're seeing the world of this moving forwards as well. And that's what we're seeing in the projects we're doing. So it's a transformational technology. Some of the stuff we're doing with BMC and BMC Helix now, and the new ways of delivering this really have transformational capability. And the challenges we're seeing are, either the projects we're going into are seen as, the traditional, I think, kind of replacing Remedy with Helix, for example, and keep it in the background and under a procurement category that is cost only, which causes a challenge because it doesn't allow that transformation to be realized. And on the other side, the challenges we see are where there's kind of over ambition, if you like. So the potential of AI, AI is still a somewhat overhyped term, and the potential is huge, but it sometimes doesn't realize its capability because things like general purpose AI are not possible. So the other thing I liked about Paul's presentation was the automation and AI was deployed in a narrow sense. Okay, so it achieved some specific pragmatic goals. And another important point word that Paul used, I had in my list, was sustained buildup of capability. So he used the word sustained quite a lot in that, which means, you don't start off with something, hyperbolic and insane. You start off with something that has top line impacting to the business, so revenue generating, which is different from what most people see operations as being. And it's constrained within its what it's trying to do, and it's deliverable, and it delivers those outcomes. And with that, you then build on capability that you've built for that first project, right? So it allows that sustained build-up of capability that at the end of the day comes back to data, right? Most telcos, in fact, most businesses need to have not just vague competency in data, but nowadays they need mastery of data. And that isn't a instant fix, even when you're working with partner organizations like NTT Data, right? You have to build up that capability, and it's a sustained investment in doing that. And to maintain that investment, you need to have top line benefit rather than just bottom line costs focus. So those are the kind of main things I think I would call out from the things I've seen in the projects we're currently working on.
One thing that intrigued me, just again to the audience, do put some questions in the Q&A box there. I have more than enough questions to keep us going for a very long time here, but I'd love to ask some of yours as well. But I guess, Paul, you use the word staff and skills, and you use those terms a few times, which led me to thinking that really there is a whole business transformation. To pick up on what Lawrence said, this is about a whole business transformation. I imagine there's a degree of coordination required across the whole business. So if we're talking about changing the capabilities, the staffing, the skills, as we go across the organization, that must need some kind of central coordination, some central executive sponsorship. I'd be interested from your point of view, Paul, how was that handled in PCCW? How have you managed to get the whole organization behind the changes that you're talking about?
Yeah, thank you, Barry. The transformation really began through, so I joined the organization via acquisition in 2017, and I had the opportunity to do the world tour and visit the large offices of PCCW Global and share some perspective with the CEO, Mark Holfinger, about observations. And predominantly my background's been in software and network. And as I began to describe some of the opportunities for improvement, the term agile began to emerge. As meeting a development community that we had and hearing about their challenges in terms of they think they understand the user problem, but they don't have a way to describe how to deliver that value to the go-to-market team, or frustration with the product managers about the developers don't understand, or the network engineers don't understand what I need to have achieved. So as I continued that tour, it became clear to the CEO and I that a lot of the challenges we were facing could be addressed if we were able to adopt an agile mindset and an agile way of working. So I began a journey in looking into the various agile frameworks that exist, large enterprise scale Scrum, and the scaled agile framework emerged as one that I put forward as a recommendation. I chose it because its body of knowledge is all publicly available. You can go to the scaledagileFramework.com website, and unlike some of the other frameworks that exist around agile, that accessibility has been key to ensuring those who are interested in adopting the framework gain access to it. There's no sort of licensing cost for us. The only cost that we bear by adopting the framework is in the training and certification, and we've now achieved the point where we can train the trainer. So cost of adoption was low, accessibility was high, and we were able to gain access to a pretty geographically broad base of educators to help us begin that journey. So that was key to our success in terms of achieving such a broad base of adoption, was the accessibility of the framework. Our ability to sustain, as Lawrence mentioned, our ability to sustain this evolution is really been through the evolution of the Scaled Agile framework. So when we adopted, it was version 4. As some of the traditionally agile adopting companies were technology orientated, as we came to the Scaled Agile framework, we had feedback saying it's too software centric. It's, the language is a barrier to adoption for us. And we've seen the framework adapt quite successfully over the course of the last 3 years to neutralize its software-specific language, focus more on business outcomes, and help provide that common language across the whole organization. So I think that hopefully that answers the question, Barry, but just to reiterate, it really came down to the significant commitment of the executive leadership team to acknowledge that many of our customers were going on an agile journey. And if we didn't do that too, we wouldn't have the ability to understand or empathize with them and build products and services that are meaningful to their transformation. So we have to go on that journey with our customer base.
Right. Yeah. And that does address the question, I guess, is the executive sponsorship and then putting in place a program to really make a deliberate transition in the business. Joseph, I see you nodding there as Paul's talking away. Does that resonate with you as to what you see in customers around the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's interesting, right? If you look at AIOps and why we need AIOps, one of the things we're seeing is it's just the increase in volume of data and the complexity of data, right? So the approaches that you use traditionally, you can use rule-based mechanisms, right? Define, here's my domain knowledge, I can define rules and how I want to address these problems. Those approaches don't scale anymore, right? So what we start to see is that, especially as you look ahead, as you look at what's happening in the environment, right? Whether it's telco, whether it's traditional data center, complexity is something that's going to increase. What's fascinating is you look at how in technology we evolve, right? We introduce new mechanisms, new approaches, new architectures, but they generally don't replace those old ones as well, right? You tend to have hybrid systems where you might be adopting Kubernetes, cloud serverless computing in public cloud, but you still have the traditional mainframe running a legacy application, right? So you've got that environment where you've got complexity of data, the dependencies become more complex, and trying to address that with traditional approaches just don't work anymore. They won't scale. And so that's why it's important to really understand how do we get on top of that, right? How do we apply technology? How do we have the right technology platform? So that's a key piece. And I know we've talked about data throughout this whole session. It really comes down to data, right? That data is, like I said, the volume is increasing, the complexity is increasing. How do you make sure you bring in the right data? How do you make sure you're able to handle that? We're talking, I know there was a telco that we work with in Asia Pac, and they're talking about bringing in 20 million metrics a minute. And as they look out over the next 18 months, they're saying that's going to increase 2 or 3-fold. So it's not only that the volume of data is big, but it's continuing to increase, right? So whatever we do, whatever approach we take, we've got to make sure that we understand, do I have the right technology foundation? Can I consume that data? Do I have the right algorithms to be able to process the data? And then can I take the actionable, can I obtain actionable insights and provide information to my stakeholders that actually helps my business, rather than just bringing a whole bunch of noise into the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's yeah, it's interesting to see some of the figures there, and that very much drives into the, well, you have to be able to do some degree of automation because otherwise you're not going to be able to respond to that information. Lawrence, back to this idea of how we sort of make the transformation happen. I know when you and I were talking previous to this event, you very much were on the executive sponsorship is essential. Maybe you could talk a little about your experience there.
Yeah, sure. So and I think it comes back to what we've spoken about already, which is talking about these technologies and the sustained buildup of that data capability to as part of your business is the telco's business of achieving competitive advantage. Okay, so no, I think a lot of it getting you know, let's be honest, right? When we go in to talk about these kind of remedy replacements, whether it's Helix or something else, you know, we're working with BMC a lot on this. It's very often tempting in the telcos to relegate that back into very much into the like for like replacement. Okay. Because still telcos, and I used to work in a telco, so I can talk about this. You know, they have procurement, you know, categories, and this is definitely put into the we're going to procure on cost only, right? So the aim here is to do the stakeholder view and get sponsorship buy-in to look at this as a build-up of capability for the business to achieve top line competitive advantage, right? So achieve increased revenues, deliver new products and services. Think about these, automating these processes, understanding these data in terms of customer experience, and then extending it out to include employee and partnerships as we move into more kind of extended ecosystems, right? This will include, I think Paul kind of hinted at that quite a lot, which is delivering these automated capabilities to your clients, but also it'll be increasingly to ecosystem partners that are helping to build your go-to-market project. So really that is about achieving executive level buy-in, because if you get that, there's a couple of things you get with that. First of all, you can achieve significant investments. I think in Ram's presentation, he also mentioned that, right? That it requires significant and sustained, we'll use that word again, significant and sustained investment to make a difference in this area. And the second thing it does is it allows you to make rapid decisions, okay, to progress that forwards. And like with any of these big transformation programs, the next thing you've got to do is look at achieving some quick wins, some immediate business benefit, right? So again, the processing of this data is difficult. The application of machine learning and AI is typically achieve success in a narrow bounded way. So rather than there still is no general purpose AI. So we have to define use cases and objectives that are realistic but add to our sustained capability. So if you're just achieving major executive level buy-in, but you don't deliver any business benefit for years, then you've also failed, right? So the program has to be, whatever we're going to call it, ambitious pragmatism, right? So something that is about building sustained capability, is about delivering data mastery. Because back to Joseph's point, right? I'd argue that telcos have always had, a surfeit of data. They just never know what to do with it. But now, the luxury of ignoring most of that stuff and having, experienced engineers and heroic efforts to get stuff through is gone. It's no longer an option. We have to automate, and the software-defined everything demands that happens. And the dynamism of new networks insists that we make that change. But this is now the opportunity to automate the operations of that, but also elevate that to a top line affecting business. But we have to make sure that we're delivering programs of change that deliver benefits in human lifespans, right? We have to deliver them within, well, at least career lifespans, right? Within a regular beat of narrow bounded projects that deliver a set of use cases that deliver benefit, whether it's cost reduction in automation or revenue creation, whether it's employee affecting or customer affecting, but all of those things, regular tempo of business affecting positive upsides, that we can keep that momentum going. That to me would be the kind of recipe for success in this area. I think at the end of it, you then hopefully get, if you keep this going as sustained investment, you then get an inherent capability, as say, an agile business that has a mastery of data in general, and allows that kind of rapid change to outpace your competition is where we would end up with. So
we've got a question in here that I'll just rephrase slightly. I mean, talking about AI, I guess it's a general AI question, but really bringing it into the operational world. An AI system is only as good as what it's learned how to do, in terms of, I think the question is aiming at a service assurance environment. So if it doesn't know what the recovery actions available to it, if that isn't a case that the AI system has been trained for, then and in highly complex networks, then potentially, there's a challenge. But I guess in my mind, my answer would always be, well, okay, you will always have situations where my AI can't solve that problem, and therefore I have to have traditional methods. So if I have a situation where I've had an AI system spot an issue, it doesn't understand the recovery actions, and then pass that into a coexisting manual operational paradigm. And I just wonder about the coexistence of those. I know, having been involved in the radio domain, when we talked about self-optimizing networks, one of the most common questions from battle-hardened engineers was, okay, so when it all goes wrong, how am I supposed to fix it? How am I supposed to figure out how it got to where it is? And you know, the first thing, we're all engineers, the first thing you do is you undo the last change and see if that fixes it, right? So very long rephrasing of a question there, but maybe Paul, how do you see that in your organization in terms of the sitting alongside of these automated processes, and then how those play nicely with a more manual, or almost a manual override, or a traditional way of working?
So I spoke on the topic a little while ago, and as I answered the question, it came to light that part of what we're using is BPMN, so business process markup language. So a lot of the work we do around service assurance and service automation is built on a workflow engine. And because we're, as we know, orchestrating complex networks which have varying state over time, and we're integrating them with these hyperscalers whose APIs change, and mean time to responsive API calls can change. We've invested in a test automation framework, and so we modularize the value proposition, whether it's be automated connectivity to AWS or automated connectivity to Azure, or just automated connectivity between data centers, and we write a test for it. And so that test automation framework becomes this, I guess what the question was alluding to, you've got this gap of knowledge of potential outcomes that an AI wouldn't understand. And as I went to answer the question, I thought, well, we've actually been building that body of knowledge because we fire a test battery against our production API every 24 hours. And we're continuing to evolve and learn, okay, in this context, in this environment, we can anticipate there'll be a high standard deviation of API response time when provisioning connectivity to AWS. So therefore we improve our test harness and our knowledge. So that's sort of building on the test-driven development paradigm to help an AI learn all of the possible parameters that we're encountering in a real world production deployment. I think the other question that when I read the question in the Q&A chat, the other thing there is about this increasing complexity. And I think one of the reasons that PCCW Global and played roles in the Linux Foundation, standardization is the key to mitigating the explosion of complexity. And why TM Forum, Linux Foundation, and others are so critical is because they can allow you to get reusability. So you can write to one API spec, and sure, you may be integrating with 2 or 3 different network as a service providers, but the body of code you develop should be relatively coherent across each of those implementations. So I think that's certainly the strategy we're taking in terms of mitigating the risk of your complexity explosion.
I do want. Can I jump in as well? I think that's fascinating what you said there, because of course there is also the option of, I say, being handled then by a human engineer, an experienced engineer, and then the machine learning then learning that, and you're doing that with test harnesses, and maybe we move to kind of synthetically created scenarios that also exercise the AI and improve the machine learning. I do wonder if there will be a time, and maybe soon, that companies like yourselves and maybe BMC and others start generating. We talk about new products and services, new categories. So I can imagine there being a time when we enter a kind of essentially algorithmic marketplace, right? Where you have created resilient AI engines that deal with certain situations, and maybe the algorithm you have is particularly competent and capable at it more than others, and that becomes a product that you sell in the market as well, to handle certain situations. Now, whether you would end up selling them to your competitors, I don't know, or whether other companies like BMC generate these from their experiences across a number of industries and then place them as a monetizable asset in the marketplace. But I can imagine, because of the difficulty in generating these competent AI engines around these kind of narrow bounded sets of use cases, whether that could become a product in its own right. It's a possibility.
Yeah, it's interesting, Paul and Lawrence, right? A couple of things jumped out on what you said, right? The number one thing, Paul, you're talking about how you test, right? How you get there. It's a process, right? And as I was reading the question, the thing that jumped out at me in the question is number one, AI is not really, it's not something you just turn on and you hope it figures things out. It's a process of how you get there. right? And the approach we've taken is, at one level, you've got all this data, right? How do I reduce the noise? There's standard algorithms for that, right? There's algorithms that look at anomalies, right? Learn over a period of time, fairly well-defined ways to do that. You can reduce all that noise and you get down to, here's the core signal, here's what you want to respond to. And then you've got this complex environment, right? The question basically talks about how in this ever-changing environment, which is something we need to acknowledge, right? The environment is going to get increasingly more dynamic. We're also recognizing this in terms of how we did discovery of environments. We could afford to do this once a night, right? Go out, discover the environment. It's fairly static view. You can't do that anymore, right? You've got containers, you've got auto scaling in place, you've got serverless, you've got all these changes happening. So you've got to make sure you've got a really good idea of what's happening, a good topological view that you're leveraging in terms of identifying your root cause, because that's what it's really down to, right? What's the root cause that you're trying to automate? So if you've got all this data, you've reduced it down to noise, you've got to be able to understand in the context of the dependencies, what is the root cause? And then you're able to now automate the action to that. If I've identified, here's the root cause, it's this network router that's actually causing this business service to be impacted, now I can take a corrective action. But what's important in the corrective action is there's a journey of getting there as well, right? So how do you make sure that you're leveraging the automation that's in place? Lawrence, you're talking about how potentially there could be a marketplace, right? Internally, if you think about any organization, there's automation that exists, right? There's scripts that people have written, whether it's an automation center of excellence, whether it's different application teams, there's all those automations that have been written. How do you bring that into your framework for responding to these situations? So from a BMC perspective, we've taken an automation broker approach with Helix, right? The ability to basically tie a probable cause for a problem to the corrective action. And you can start doing that manually, right? You might run it a few times and we can start tracking how successful is that. We can bring in user feedback into that. That's a part of what we're developing as well. So it's almost starting to recommend out of the automations available, using AI, ML, not to simply take an automated action, but to look at all the possible automations and to recommend based on history, based on success, this is what makes sense, right? And now once you've gotten a level of trust, you can automate that. You can define a policy that says every time I see this situation, go ahead and execute this action automatically. But I think the process, if it's a journey that gets you there, you've got to trust it. That's an important one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's key. But I guess back to my point, you still have to run. You're not going to turn on. You're not going to start that journey everywhere all at once. Yeah. So I guess that's a whole nother field. Is what are the steps? And I think Lawrence, you talked about both aspects. Think big, but you've got to start small. And so while you're running small, I guess you have to pick something that you can make these changes. You can go on the journey that you described there, Joseph, but you have to do that in a piece of the business with a new part of the business. And I guess, how do you pick those areas? What would be an example of a business service, or would you pick a service, or would you pick one aspect of many services, or how do you pick the piece where you start small whilst thinking big and go on that journey and then work from there? I mean, Lawrence said, in terms of NTT, what's your experience been of sort of good start points, if you like?
That's such a simple question and a massively complex answer, but I'll keep it short. So I think, like every good answer to a difficult question, the answer is it depends, right? So for telcos, and a lot of it depends on the internal capabilities of the organization or its plan around increasing capability. So if and the conversations at what level in the organization you're talking. So for example, deploying this kind of capability, if you're going to, a classic consulting would be a 2x2, right? What's relatively easy based on your partners, the capability and understanding of the data, and what delivers business value fastest. And some of it might be related to looking at classic ITSM stuff, or something around improving employee productivity, right? Whichever way you cut it, even in telcos, employees are still one of the largest, if not the largest, costs to the business. And for example, we don't hire. Nobody hires people anymore, or employees. They hire talent, and then we end up putting our talent to work doing a lot of mundane, repeatable and automatable activities, which seems a bit sad. So deploying something like chatbots or allowing a lot of self-serve around employees requesting new services or raising faults and getting those things fixed quickly to allow them to work. That's an immediate benefit. It's still kind of bottom line impacting, so it's cost reduction, productivity improvement, but it can then deliver pretty rapid benefits, and then you can build on top of that. So that would be one. I think that's one side, depending on the industry. Sorry, depending on the individual telco. So looking at chatbots, looking at process improvements and productivity improvements for employees. On the flip side, I think to me it would be something like Paul did, which is looking at a new category of product, right, that goes to market. So rather than worrying about fixing a whole lot of legacy and trying to tidy up a lot of stuff, is really to focus on the new category of software-defined networks or software-defined and digital-first go-to-market products, and then focusing on those in a very narrow-bounded way, but making sure they are designed with automation and security from the get-go, and that would allow you to. But that would include, by the way, service design aspects. So that is a designed customer endpoint, designed view of how those services are delivered, and then all of that automated through highly capable systems like BMC Helix. So I think it's either or, right? So looking at that, narrow bounded, what can I deliver immediately in the classic employee sense, or the ITSM or ITOM place, or you look at new types of business and whether you could categorize, can encapsulate a single new product and then focus on automating that.
So Paul, I mean, what would your advice to a CSP looking or any kind of digital service provider looking to embark on this journey? What would your advice be as to how to start small?
Yeah, I think Lawrence's perspective about that narrow band, find something that's going to be a new go-to-market, because you're going to get support from the business for revenue generation and development, as opposed to cost optimization, which isn't always as easy to clarify the benefits. So I think Lawrence's perspective is absolutely correct there. And then, I think it's really key to establish inside the organization this culture around agility, particularly for the telecommunication service provider industry, which has always been trapped in a legacy waterfall, traditional project management life cycles, which doesn't deliver that. Certainly has built some of the great networks of the world, but it doesn't deliver that adaptability and the ability to think about the problem that we're trying to domain. That empathy with breaking the engineering mindset and having the customer empathy mindset is really core to that agile experience. So I think it's a combination of a very narrow focus and then providing the psychological framework for the network engineering and the software engineering community to think comfortably about empathizing with the requirement you're trying to solve.
Right. So
Yeah.
so it's almost you've got to embark on.
Because that was, sorry, but I was just going to say that's an important point I think I missed, which is telcos still think in terms of projects. Projects will not allow you to build that sustained capability improvement. So they have to think absolutely in terms of products and things like scaled agile, and the ability to launch release trains with consequent improvements is exactly the right methodology to start adopting in this space. So sorry, Barry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to check my understanding there. You did almost the same thing, which is you're saying effectively, Paul, that you need the agile way of working, or the scaled agile way of working. And like you, I'm a big fan of the scaled agile framework. To me, the you need to be in that agile way of working, and then maybe start on something new, where instead of trying to pick up existing learning and automate it, you don't really have anything, so you may as well start with something new. But you're combining, you need that agile way of working, because this is going to be iterative. This is going to be about making it work, understanding it. So you're bringing those two elements of change at once, and of course it's easier to do that in a new group of services where you don't have an existing legacy. Joseph, would you agree with that piece of advice?
Yeah, I mean, overall, absolutely, right. I think, Lawrence, the point you made earlier of you can't have this being a long-term project that that basically you see the rewards at the end of your career, right? That doesn't make sense. You've got to be able to show value very quickly, right? So it's got to be something where you can show value. There's a couple of different ways to look at it, right? So one, completely agree that if you can identify problems that you're not able to solve today, right? This is a whole new area. This is new insights that you just don't have. That's basically an overall advantage that you wouldn't have without these initiatives, right? But there is, I don't want to completely downplay the value of a better way of doing things, right? That you might be doing with a lot of manual processes as well. One example, right, from the ITSM sense is this whole notion of looking at incidents, right? After the fact, you've got all these incidents and you're trying to identify patterns, right? You're looking at, maybe over 3 to 6 months, you want to understand what are the clusters of incidents from a problem management perspective, where are you spending time? Today, we've got people spending huge amounts of time doing that. And traditionally, the challenge has been that trying to identify these patterns, you've had to have human beings do that, right? Because when people open up tickets, they don't always use exactly the same descriptions, right? Those descriptions can be slightly different. And we haven't had in the past the technology to be able to automate that. Now, the reality is today we do, right? We've got clustering algorithms that can go in, they can look at similarity of incidents, even if the descriptions are logged differently, right? Through the combination of natural language processing as well as clustering. Those technologies can go in and identify, here's these patterns, be able to identify how much time have you spent, and that whole problem management exercise, it can be automated and done much more efficiently than we can. So I don't want to underplay that, right? This value of how do you apply that? And you can almost look at it, Ram talked about it earlier, right? If you look at an approach, try to figure out, does this new approach give you a huge advantage over what you're doing, right? If it's only a slight advantage and you're going to spend a whole bunch of resources, it's probably not worth it. But if you're fundamentally doing things a lot better, then that might be worth doing, right? And that might be a place to start as well. How do you start with this historical analysis? Now, from a BMC perspective, we've got those capabilities, but we've also got actual real-time incident clustering as well. But you might start with the proactive and you've got something to compare it against, right? And you understand very quickly, is this a better way to do it before I move on to real-time analysis as well, right? So I'd say both approaches make sense. Look for those opportunities, but clearly you got to start, show success, and be able to do this in small chunks, right? Operate in an agile fashion.
So yeah, I'm just thinking that is a different approach, isn't it? So it's saying instead of, so my problem of my operations needing to run in parallel, and I always think of this, we've got a problem, the automated system can't fix it, so we now have to hand it to a human being. That always seems quite time sensitive, I guess. So to be clear, the environment you're talking about is, rather than get involved in my real time fixing the problems now, I use the AIOps to sort of be a one order up. So how do I improve and how do I do the sort of the offline? Is if I understand you correctly.
That's one approach, absolutely. But again, so again, to be clear, right? So two things. So one is, how do you make sure that you're solving problems that you can't? So from a real-time perspective, back to the complexity, if there's so much data, you can't write the rules that take care of how do you identify the root cause, right? So for those types of situations, apply AIOps. We've got the ability, we've got the technology, right? We've got platforms that can bring in data, reduce the noise, identify the probable cause, and you can quickly tell, is this working? Because right? Once a system starts telling you, here's the root cause, very quickly, is this right? Is it wrong? You can start providing feedback, training the system, and you're starting to get value that you didn't have before. But what I'm saying is you can do that in parallel with actually looking at these offline approaches as well. So it's not one or the other, they're not mutually exclusive. Look for those opportunities where it makes sense. And I would say take both approaches, right? Take the approach of where can you leverage AIOps, where it can give you value, where it can do things that human beings simply can't do today. And also look for those opportunities where it can do it much better than what human beings can do today. Yeah. And both those approaches can help you, right? Don't one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If I look at the Q&A now, just another question from Gurjit there, which was around not being able to do this in isolation and being able to look at an ecosystem of operators and partners. And I think that to me that smells like a seeded question from TM Forum, right? Because that could be an ideal new initiative from TM Forum, and creating something like whether it's a kind of robot university with a set of certified machine learning data across a set of operators that have tried, that are pushing out in this space, but kind of generating real and a synthetic data that allows these tools to crank through their machine learning processes much faster and learn from other operators where it isn't delivering competitive advantage necessarily, and then maybe extend this into exactly what I said before, which is around a set of essentially AI, an algorithm marketplace of some sort, whether that's through TM Forum or something else. But absolutely that idea of, as we said, the data question to make this work is often a question of scale now.
Yeah.
Operators often can't afford the time and effort to do this when things are falling over. They need that kind of heroic effort to get them back working. So maybe there is a place for TM Forum to look at that kind of collaboration in this as well.
Yeah, I don't think that one was a plant, but you're right, it should have been. So thank you for that. I want to move to another, because also talking about partnerships there, I was going to take that as a cue to talk in another area. One of the things, I just wrote some words down as you were talking at the beginning, Paul, and we've talked about staff and skills that you said many times, but the other thing you kept referring to partners. And I guess that cuts two ways, in that I think you're working with partners who expect automation, but do you see a challenge that your partners have to be, if you want to move to a more automated world, does that require that your partners are moving at the same pace as you? And is that a problem that some are not ready to move at the same pace as you? Or how does that work? It feels like if you're in an ecosystem play that you're in, everybody's kind of got to move at the same pace, or is that not the case?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. When I was presenting I introduced the term partner because it shows up in the Scaled Agile framework when you're operating at beyond a program and in a solution level. And BMC was one of our first partners that agreed to work with us in an agile way of working. So we actually brought BMC onto one of our agile release trains. We went through program increment planning together. BMC committed to a series of sprints and deliverables. And that form of partnership was highly successful in terms of demonstrating to the rest of the business, okay, this new agile way of working isn't confined to the way we operate. It can be extended to our partners, whether it be a vendor or whether it be another telecommunications provider. So that's why I introduced that term, because BMC's been a really good partner with us in terms of when we did our on-prem to cloud migration, we planned it out as a program increment, and we had committed deliverables, not following a work breakdown structure, but an actual commitment in terms of a feature team from BMC to do the work that we needed to, and we had visibility on those interdependencies. With the broader partner community, though, in terms of telecommunications, you're absolutely right, Barry. It is one of those things where we'd love to have more of our partners operating a software-defined interconnection platform so that we could offer that broad global coverage where we don't have a network point of presence. And we just have to be pretty pragmatic. Every quarter we have a backlog of partners, and then we'll take the same approach. We'll bring them into our planning sessions. One's actually executed earlier today, and we'll co-plan with our partners, say, okay, how far can you get? What meaningful business value can we generate over the course of the next 90 days so that we can actually demonstrate to our respective stakeholders that we can deliver value through this partnership. And so we just sort of maintain a roster of organizations that have achieved a level of sophistication or automation in their roadmap, and make sure that they know that we're willing and able to integrate when we can.
But Barry, if I can add to that, just it's kind of interesting, right? On the question about the trial and test and isolation, how do you benefit from the knowledge and experience of others, right? Fundamentally, it comes down to a build versus buy decision as well, right? For most of those listening to this. So as you look at this, you want to make sure you can bring in data, you've got the algorithms, right? You've got the ability to scale. You've got to think about the platforms that you have. Do you have the right platform, or are you going to go build one that can scale and support that? And do you have the algorithms that can go make sense out of this? So there is a build versus buy decision. If you're looking at a buy decision, right, and hopefully I hope that all of you consider BMC, that the characteristics that you have to look at is, number one, are the platforms scalable? Are they open? Can you connect in through API-based approaches to all these different tools? So how scalable is this? Is this a modern architecture? One of the reasons we adopted microservices-based architectures, right, leverage Kubernetes, is for exactly that, is so that we can auto-scale, support those volumes of data. That's number one. Number two is, does it come with knowledge? Does it come with the benefit of data scientists having done that analysis, having looked at data across different domains that have come in and have said, here's the types of algorithms for these types of problems. Fundamentally, nobody's writing new algorithms, right? There's probably a few new algorithms being written, but it's the application of those existing algorithms to different problems, right? So if you're buying the technology, does it exist? Do you have that knowledge that comes out of the box? Can that AI ML learn from your environment, right? So do you have knowledge out of the box? Can it learn? And also the third element is, if you've got domain knowledge internally, is that something that you can teach? Is that something that you can provide to the system so it better learns from your environment as well? So I think that's what you've got to look at, and you've got to make a decision of, do I build this all myself and try to partner with somebody else? Or do I go obtain something where there's a technology platform in place with the knowledge that benefits from experiences from others that I can now augment with my own knowledge as well? I think that's a fundamental decision that everyone needs to consider.
And I guess the other piece, when we talk about ecosystem, and Paul, you talked about how you're delivering services with other ecosystem partners, is about the interconnect, as you say, both the interconnect to your platform, but I guess the standards as well. The obviously this is something very dear to the TM Forum's heart, but I guess let's start with Paul. In terms of maturity of the industry, in terms of people making the data you need available, and also the APIs for you to be able to perform the actions, make the requests you want through, how mature is the industry in terms of the ecosystem partners you wish to actually deliver services with, to having those standards in place? And how much are you still having to do a lot of translation to different information models, different APIs, et cetera, et cetera?
And different distributed ledgers. So there's a whole element of underlying data store that is quite quickly being adopted, but again introduces yet another layer in the reference architecture where we don't have standardization. So certainly from my perspective, I'll be blunt, Barry, I think the standards organizations are lagging implementation. Console Connect delivered automated, full software-defined interconnection in 2015, and well before TM Forum, MEF, or any others were considering, even the address validation and quoting and then ordering, and some were now considering provisioning. We'd done that full life cycle over 6-7 years ago. So, but that's appropriate. I don't think that's an issue. I've been involved in the Linux community for many years. Standards often lag implementation because there has to be this forefront of Horizon 3 innovation, and then standards begin to coalesce around those successful implementations. So I don't see that as an issue. And I think there's a separation of concerns beginning to emerge, where CBAN is beginning to identify the sort of services, like the practical services that are required for these standards, API-based standards deployments to exist. And the CBAN reference architecture, identity services are being considered. They're sort of core components to actually do the work. And then TM Forum and MEF, I think, are both sort of building out that information model, data model, even with Etsy and GSMA. Now sort of contributing around. But I think in 2022, 2023, we'll certainly see the carrier industry move into much more production deployment. There's some fragmentation there, but they're relatively aligned quite successfully around the CBAN reference architecture.
Right. Lawrence, I don't know if do you have a different view into? I guess standards always will, contributed standards always will lag deployment. It's if there's 3 of them lagging it in 3 different ways, and nobody's adopting any of them, that it's a problem, right? So it's not so much the lag, it's the fact there isn't fragmentation. And Lawrence, what are you seeing? Lack of adoption or lack of anything to adopt, or fragmentation as a challenge, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think general adoption is a challenge. I think generally, I think around AI. Generally, and the deployment of it in real life situations is I think we're at this point now where the hype's outplaying the actual pragmatic implementations, and I think that's for all of the reasons that we've mentioned before. So I think, like a lot of these things, when they start sniffing like they're becoming mainstream, or where interoperability has more of a value play than having it separate, and that's where, you know, something's where the competitive advantage is delivered for each telco within their industry. So the reason why I always think that I've looked at some other industries and dabbled in them as well, but one of the things that telcos across the world have been good at is defining standards and interoperability, because that has stronger, you know, upside value to those industries, the individual companies, than keeping it independent and separate. So as soon as it starts looking like the interoperability or the sharing of information delivers better upside, I think that's where the standards will come. That's why there is always a lag, to be honest, because there will be early adopters that see this as a major area of competitive advantage. So I think the trick for interoperability is looking at the standards and definitions of those at a base level, and then using things like the core data or the way it's deployed, or how you can use these AI tools and data around creation of new compelling products that are sold to your customers, and selling them in more compelling and digitally centered ways. I think that's where we should be delivering that competitive advantage. So at some level, there'll be layers of this, right? And at some level will be the sweet spot of general adoption in the industry, and where, you know, collaboration across CSPs, but also, you know, network providers, increasingly IT providers like BMC and others in this space will play really strongly. So I think that's got to shake out yet, to be honest. I think that people aren't really sure where it's going to happen, but and that's probably why it will be adopted in that kind of time frame, I think.
Right. Okay. Well, my little countdown timer here is telling me we're out of time. It feels like we could sit here and keep talking and just not worry that everybody else would drop off and go on to their day jobs, but that's not what we're supposed to do. So I will wrap it up at that point. For me, this is quite interesting. You know, when I looked at the title of this, the sort of the journey to AIOps, I was thinking about, you know, there's going to be a lot of technology we're going to discuss. There's going to be maturity of technology, and we touched on some maturity of technology at the end there. But if you think about the things we talked about, we all came to violent agreement on a need for executive sponsorship. We came to violent agreement on think big. This is something that is a transformation across the whole business, and in particular, it only really works if it goes hand in hand with a transformation to an agile mindset. So the think big, but we have to start small, maybe start in something new. That's a theme I've seen come up a few times when people have been looking at how to make big changes to the business. Look at some of the new technologies we have coming in. So 5G, edge computing, some of those are maybe an area where you can start with a clean sheet of paper and avoid the legacy. But again, none of that's going to happen without the executive sponsorship. And that executive sponsorship, I think you started right at the beginning, Lawrence, was saying that has to come from not seeing, as is so often the case with new paradigms of operations, this isn't about cost saving. It can be about that, but that's perhaps the hard way to do it. And really, I guess it's more about, you know, seeing this as new business, new revenue. And Paul, I think, you know, you clearly showed us that by seeing this as a new business, you can go and open up and new revenue streams that have to be approached in a new way. And then once you've proven it there and you've got that, then I would imagine that making that work across the business and bringing that to other new projects, but eventually back to the legacy, is really the way forward. So I think that's quite an interesting set of perspectives on this whole journey. Everybody's going to be in a different place. As Lawrence said, it's a hard question, so the answer will be it depends. But I think that's what we talked about there. So with that, we are really out of time. It's really just down to me to thank our panelists. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Paul, for your detailed presentation. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Joseph, for coming into this. I know that was a little bit last minute, but your insights from the other industries and you know, not in the telco world 100%, very valuable to that conversation. Thank you very much, and thank you to BMC for sponsoring this. The TM Forum likes to try and get really interesting people together to have these conversations. We couldn't do that without our sponsors, and our sponsors bring along their customers and their partners. So thank you to them, and thank you to again to Paul and to Lawrence for giving up your time to come along and share your expertise with the audience. Just to the audience, as I said before, there will be a recording of this available. If you're thinking you want to share this, or you want to listen again to some of this, that should appear tomorrow, I think. You'll get a link, and you can look at that or share it around. So just remains for me to say goodbye, and thank you for everybody for your attendance. Thank you.